Up until this point, we've been discussing missions from one predominant cosmology. And so, yes, there have been different paradigms that might relate to the function of particular elements within that cosmology, but the cosmologies remain the same. And it looks something like this. Everyone assumed the existence of God and that God is ordering the universe. Below him, you have the church. Obviously, there are non-Christian versions of this cosmology which are nearly identical, where the church could be replaced with the caliphate. The caliphate would be, I know that's a political term in modern news cycles, but looking at it historically and religiously, that was simply comparable to the Pope and the papacy and the Roman Catholic Empire as an empire. You have the same thing in Chinese religion as well, various Chinese religions, folk religion, and whatnot. And so you have the idea that God exists, that the spiritual body exists below God and at service of God. And below that are the kings and nobles, and they are beholden to the church, or in the Islamic sense, the caliphate, or whatever that religious guiding body. And there are various ways. At times, the church category and the king category are joined. Other times they're separate. Sometimes the church is on top. Sometimes the king is on top. But in the idealized version of this, both of those are working in tandem to promote God's will into the people on earth. And then below people, you have nature. As we talk about the Enlightenment paradigm of missiology, all of this is going to get turned on its head because new things become king. So there's a huge advancement during this time period of science and philosophy. And through these advancements, there's simultaneously kind of socially and politically limitations placed on the church, limitations placed on the king and on governing rulers. And so this creates an interesting mix of circumstances. It gave rise, if the church is not the one that's going to be filling out our information and our knowledge about the world, and if the church and the king combined don't represent the authority in terms of how we think of what we're going to do, think, believe, etc., then where will we arrive at our conclusions? Well, there's one gentleman named René Descartes, who is the father of rationalism, the father of the Enlightenment. And he's very famous for his saying of, "I think, therefore I am." And this saying comes as is actually one of the proofs for God in a particular apologetic model. And he said I'm doubting, therefore I'm doubting that I exist. Therefore I know that I'm thinking because I'm doubting. And if I'm thinking that I know that I exist, I think, therefore I exist. I think, therefore I am. And so from there, he kind of reasons out to, well, God must exist. And I would say kind of critically, before long, you see him relying more on his understanding of the Bible rather than pure reason, even though he would claim it was the latter. So on one side, philosophically, you have rationalism, and this becomes the predominant, the prevailing view of the day. No longer is it Scripture that's the authority, church that's the authority, or government that's the authority. Reason becomes the authority, and if I can't comprehend it, I don't need any part of it. Next is empiricism. This is the scientific method, originated largely from Francis Bacon, and these two schools of thought combined reframed how the world saw authority structure, away from God, church, king, the people, the masses, now where anyone and everyone could, in a way, become their own king insofar as they were reasonable and factual. And so now these became the formational virtues of humanity at its finest. Because before, the king was viewed to be humanity at its finest. The priesthood was humanity at its finest. And they were to help us poor commoners aspire to greatness, aspire to nobility. Well, now with reason, with enough reason, we could make that aspiration on our own. So what then of people who don't reason like us? This is what we'll get into today. And this is the basis for colonialism and the colonial model. So I just want to put a little note. I'm going to deal with the Enlightenment kind of categorically rather than chronologically. If I dealt with it chronologically, it would be very weighty, particularly boring, and just hours and hours of content. And so, in an effort to be a little bit more brief, I'm going to focus on this categorically. And in large part, I'm following Paul Hebert. He has a book called Missiological Implications of Epistemological Shifts. It's a fantastic short book. If you ever want to get into how does epistemology influence our missions thinking. And then Bosch, of course, this is one of his categorical paradigms, and so I'll be pulling from him as well. The first thing that we see in the Enlightenment, there'll be 9 things. The first is the Age of Reason. This is reason over tradition. So as rationalism became the way, tradition is thrown out, the church is thrown out, the scripture is thrown out, or at least largely questioned. Reason becomes the basis of law. And so kind of in every category, in theology, in missiology, in politics, in law, rationalism reigns as king. The mind reigns as king. So the king is no longer personified as being the law. Rather, law can be deduced almost by osmosis via reason. And so this becomes the basis of law. What would any rational person do in this scenario? Can I use my reason to determine a kind of cultural, above culture view of law? Is there something that all people in all times and all places would agree is wrong? And so this kind of becomes the basis for English common law as well. It becomes the basis for theology. So during this time period, you see a lot of people trying to do natural theology. Descartes is one of those. There are many other theologians as well who follow that. That vein of thought. And the idea is, because God created us, which we know from the Bible, I should be, and he made my mind, he made my reason, I should be able to use my reason to reason back that God exists and to understand all truth about him. Now, I don't want to denounce general revelation. I'm a big fan of general revelation. One, the Bible talks about it. Two, it does seem pretty self-evident. At the same time, Scripture would tell us general revelation only gets us to a point. Also, if you take on that more reformed view from our other paradigm that man is fallen, then is our mind also fallen? And if our mind is also fallen, then our reason can only take us to a point. Our reason is corrupted as well. And so the age of reason is reigning supreme. Second thing that you see in the second contour is the elevation of humanity. And so because of science and reason and all of the advancements, humanity is being elevated in many ways above nature. And there's this hard line drawn between humanity and nature. Prior to this, man and nature, it's not about understanding it and figuring it out. We're as much a part of nature as it is a part of us, and we have a symbiotic need. Now, obviously, we still have a symbiotic need because of our need for food and whatnot, but it's in a much more production-oriented, functionalistic kind of way. So the first idea of elevating humanity is this sense that the world can be subdued. This is the age of exploration and the age of colonialism, and so science is growing in leaps and bounds. Prior to this time, any kind of invading army was relatively on par with the countries that they were invading. It's not too far a cry to think that one of the invaded powers could simply redouble their efforts and take back what was lost. It's sword on sword. And now we're moving to a time period where, because of science, navigation, mapping, exploration, military tactics, firearms, all of these things are becoming commonplace. And so now you've got firearms versus swords. And so the few are able to exploit the many. And this is further justification in the mind of Europeans at this time that they are correct in what they're doing. And so there's this constant elevation, not just of humanity, but not just humanity. In particular, European and or Western humanity. Number 3, there's a shift from metaphysics of purpose. So when we talk about metaphysics, we're trying to explain why are things happening. What is the purpose in life? What is life's ultimate meaning? And so these were things, if you read philosophy prior to this point, and theology prior to this point, it's largely trying to answer these questions. After this point, the way that people are seen is they're not looking for why did this happen and what did it mean. They're simply looking at causality. And so meaning is subjective, they would say. Causality is a point of fact, is observable. This goes back to the scientific method that we were talking about. And so they don't want to know what does this mean. The meaning is irrelevant. What they want to know is what is the cause of this? How do we replicate this cause? How do we kind of add some juice to this cause and create a better and higher cause or effect? Sorry, what cause leads to this effect? And they want to this is the whole impetus behind invention, is how can we take simple causes and effects and turn them and multiply them into greater causes and effects. Number fourth is progress. This is a significant time of modernization. And modernization now, because there is this global knowledge. I mean, prior to this time, you lived in it was very parish-based in how you thought, very provincial. And so you lived in your province, in your town, and that was your world. There was not really, other than the random traveler that might come through, particularly for the commoner, there was not this large body of knowledge about the world. Well, now you've got explorers like Captain James Cook and others who have circumnavigated the globe by this time and have sent back drawings and stories of primitive peoples around the world. And so if you view yourself as modern, you're going to view everyone who is not like yourself as primitive and as backward. And so this again draws a line where humanity is on the rise, but some humans are more equal than other humans, if we could borrow from Orwell. And so this led to this kind of superior mindset, again, that fueled the whole colonial movement, both politically and even religiously, sadly. So progress was key as well. There was progress in science, in philosophy, in politics, exploration. Furthermore, because of the reliance on the scientific method, that wasn't a paradigm just for science alone. That began to expand into other areas. And so people started viewing theology itself as a science. And so apart from the people who do this, I don't know that they would really argue that it's apart from the guidance of the Holy Spirit. But ultimately, if we reduce theology to a science, then we simply put the scriptures into this mechanical crank it out, and then out comes legitimate, correct interpretation. I don't think this is a really great model for doing hermeneutics and interpretation. But that is something that was developed during this time. There is neutrality in information, or I would say assumed neutrality in information. That just became the default position, was that if there was scientifically derived information, this is elevated beyond feeling. It is elevated beyond even reason. And so I mentioned those two schools of thought, rationalism and empiricism. On the one hand, they both fueled the Enlightenment. On the other hand, they're kind of at odds with each other philosophically. And so empiricism wants to look at scientific method and just raw, hard data. Rationalism wants to use the mind. And so of the two, empiricism wins out over this. So there's this ideal that information itself, that scientifically deduced information, is neutral. It is culture-free. Paul Hebert, in that book I mentioned, Missiological Implications of Epistemological Shifts, he lays out some definitions of what he calls positivism. And so positivism is one element of this assumed neutrality in information. First is that there's a confidence in the validity of the scientific method. The scientific method itself is sound and does produce correct results. What the scientific method does not produce is meaning. It simply shows cause and effect in repeatable and observable circumstances. That is a very limited set of knowledge when you really think about it. There also was objective realism. So the outside world actually exists. Our mind actually exists. Reason actually exists. That sounds sort of obvious, like a tautology. Part of it is we are reading this here in post-Enlightenment era, but it's seen as a mechanical. It's not just that the world exists; it's that it exists as a mechanical entity. And so, prior to this, you would have seen God's favor or God's curse in blessing and calamity as it relates to nature. So God, you're praying to God to send the rain. It's not that they didn't understand rain cycles, but there was just, again, remember the order of the cosmology prior to this time: God, church, king, the people, the earth. And so there's this top down with God on top understanding to everything. Well, now it's very, very different. And so it's not just that the world exists, it's that it exists as a mechanical entity, which means where is God in this scenario? If he is there at all, he is at least distant, absent, and uninvolved. And so this is theologically, this is the birth of, not the birth of deism, but an increase in deism in theological and just secular circles as well, for that matter. So the world exists, the world is mechanical, and it is under our powers of observation, i.e., scientific method. And so the world exists and we exist, and it is beneath us. We are its masters. Again, there's this sense of progress, pride, confidence, the ability to overcome. All of these are very common attitudes of we will subdue everything. So it's mechanical, and because it's mechanical, it is beneath us, and we can dissect the parts and categorize it and pull it apart and analyze it and put it back together and figure out how to make it work better. Under positivism, there's the elimination of metaphysics. If the world is just a machine, it doesn't matter what it means. In fact, it probably has no meaning at all. And so it leaves from that kind of human soul side, there's this chasm that develops during this time of we're not seeking meaning in things. This obviously takes a very dark turn in philosophy, as some philosophers start arguing that life is meaningless. Some of the philosophers that would teach this actually would have to warn their students, you cannot follow this philosophy out to its logical conclusion, because it would end in suicide, obviously. There's a distinction in this time between fact and feeling. This is part of positivism. So facts are on top and feelings are below. This is the difference between objective and subjective knowledge. So faith, where do we put that in this scenario? Faith goes in the bottom. It's just your own idea, your own sentimentality, your own cultural tradition. But science is cultural. It does not have culture. It is amoral. It's neither right nor wrong. It's ahistorical. Science becomes, where Plato and the Greeks would have put logic and reason in this kind of eternal chair, this eternal form out there, Enlightenment thinkers are now placing science and human progress in that chair of these things we know are just evident everywhere. What they didn't see is it had only recently become evident everywhere that that's how the world was working, or so they thought. So back to our main list. So number 5 was neutrality of information. Number 6 is problems have a solution. We've looked at the world. We can dissect it and pull it apart. So we can overcome this problem given enough time and resources. Now, I'm saying these, and I don't want to convey a negative tone. I'm myself very proud of my problem-solving skills. I love to take on a new task, a new challenge, dissect the parts, pull it apart, figure out what's not working, get it back together and get it working. That's very satisfying to me. So these traits are not altogether wrong. This simply fuels a particular brand of missiology that has both positive and negative impacts in the world. Number 7, all of this leads to the rise of individualism. If the world is simply mechanical, then all of the other structures we put in place is simply tradition. Sentimentality is our culture, but all of these other things are above culture and above time. And so there's this rise of individualism. I have to rely on, if you're on the rational side, my reason, my ability to comprehend. If you're on the empirical side, it's my powers of observation. So in both of those, we're assuming that either our reason or our powers of observation are untainted and unfailing. And this leads to a rise of individualism. Also comes from the loss of church and state being joined. It also comes from the loss of the cosmology of God, church, king, people, the world. But it's the church used to have a strong dominion throughout the world. And again, we're speaking predominantly of a church at an empire level. But now the church is being privatized. You're having whole denominations that are congregational rule, that are democratic. This is a time in the West where democracy is on the rise, politically speaking. And so individualism becomes a huge part of this. Religion itself becomes privatized and individualized. Again, this relates to the end of state religion. I can now live in a place and choose my own religion. I don't have to be the religion of the governor or the president or the king. It's up to me. Don't even have to be the religion of my family at some point. And so, while this might not be socially acceptable, neither will it get you burned at the stake. And so these changes become much more personal. Prior to this time, to speak of religion was to use the word religion like piety, not to speak of religion as a cohesive set of beliefs, practices, etc., that leads one towards transcendence. Now that's definitely how we use the word. So in theology and in missions, you would never hear people talk about the pagan religion. They would just talk about paganism. Or even they wouldn't call it the Christian religion. Christianity is true, and then there's all of these other things that must go out there and in some manner or another be conquered. Well, during this time, everything starts getting studied and categorized as an ism. And so all of this becomes very private and becomes very individualized. There's the rise of secularization during this time. Since there's no more church and state being joined, and since the science and reason have moved into the driver's seat of authority, fact, knowledge, all of this, it has sidelined everything else. And so secularism is on the rise. Let's keep religion private and individual. If you want it, that's fine, have it, but put it in its place. It does not belong in the sciences. So what the scientific revolution that was birthed out of Christianity is now looked back at Christianity and said, I have no need of you. Go back from whence you came. And so, you can have your religion, just put it in its proper place. There's a box, a compartmentalized box, put it there, and don't let it bleed into any other area of society. And so, because of separation of church and state, and the absence of a global empire church, such as the Roman Catholic Church, religion becomes a private matter, and there's the rise of secularization. You have entire countries now, countries like France, that at this time they're making those steps towards we are going to be a political body not centered around a uniting religious idea or denomination. We are secular. It's ironically, on that particular note, now that globalization has taken effect and people are feeling the disorientation from not feeling at home anymore, France, specifically in regards to Islam, is trying to counter Islam by claiming that it is in fact a Christian nation, when it has been their bedrock policy since their revolution that they are secular. And so religion has been a crutch for them one way or the other to be used or exploited to do their bidding. And finally, from all of this, put yourself in this society. Science has made such advancement. We know so much more about the world. The kind of knowledge that a person could sit on if they were reading some of the books that were being published at the time was worlds generations ahead of their parents or their grandparents and where they were, to the same degree that for those of us in this year, if you think about our grandparents or great grandparents even, probably were alive before or saw the advent of the telephone. And here we are, we sit with smartphones that are more powerful probably than the first computers that we all use maybe. And so there's this, if you live in this world where there's been such increase, such a development of resources, technology, military, political power, etc., and then you start coupling that with a contrast of, but the world's peoples live in squalor. The world's peoples live in mud huts. The world's peoples don't understand science the way we understand science. They are still thinking that this animistic spirit or this tribal god is causing the rain, but we know better. This creates what we call manifest destiny. And so America is known for manifest destiny, and there's actually a bit of bitterness between us and our European counterparts because we are the new kid on the block, as it were, and we stole manifest destiny from Europe. But prior to the advent of the United States, Europeans saw themselves as having a manifest destiny, that God had given them all of this brilliance to go out into the world and to spread it. They were obligated now, not to just hold this for themselves in selfishness, no, but in big-heartedness and generosity, to go and spread it throughout the world and to improve the life of these poor, pitiful heathens throughout the world. Like I said, America, because of I would say our pioneer roots and the people who were willing to get on a boat, cross an ocean, and go to a land where there was nothing. Only certain kinds of people applied for that, and because of that, we are even more functional, more efficient, more progressive than, at least in terms of technology and whatnot, than our European counterparts. And so, within a few generations, it wasn't just that the Western world saw manifest destiny. It's that the United States in particular stole this from them, and you can see a lot of bitterness in their writings over this at different points. And this is what we call American exceptionalism, that in particular we have been blessed with democracy and resources and knowledge and wisdom and Christianity. And because of that, we become a missionizing force on all of those categories. It wasn't that long ago we were fighting a war in Iraq, and part of the call to arms was, let's spread democracy throughout the Middle East. And people got on board. This kind of civil religion, people who are culturally Christian got on board because they saw that as, well, democracy is Christian, and to spread democracy is a Christian thing to do. And so during this time of manifest destiny, and in particular American exceptionalism, this is point number 9, we see a rise of Western involvement. This is the colonial moment. Backwards people were said to not be fit for self-rule. This is a time of religious imperialism. There's the creation of societies to spread the faith. Prior to this, the spreading of the faith belonged to the church / the empire, where now during this time, while governments are going out and taking over lands in Africa and South America and Asia, the church is following behind them. And there's this sense where we have an obligation to go and spread our technological brilliance, but now missionaries are going and they have the obligation to spread their faith. And so there was this call to that colonization is civilizing and Christianizing. And it doesn't matter which side of that you're on. If you're on the secular political side, at some point people would put pressure on you of, we should do more to help Christianize. If you're on the Christianizing side, as a missionary, there was this idea that you should be part of helping to spread your political and theopolitical views. And so you were going on mission on behalf of your country, and many missionaries at this time saw their service not just in service of God, but I am doing this for France, for Germany, for Britain, for America. And so they saw a patriotic connection. So let's pause for a moment, and we'll turn our mind to how the Enlightenment affected specifically church and mission.